Vaal Flameblast Ignite is my all-round starter of choice this upcoming league. It is one of the fastest scaling builds, with the clear of proliferating ignites and well-rounded defenses that are adaptable to each stage of the game. I plan to take this build directly into boss rushing with boss farming immediately on league start paired with ultimatum. And in the late game POB, estimated for about day or 2 or day 3 in soft core, this is viable for farming all content including all Ubers. While the strongest starter of this league probably continues to be Detonate Dead Ignite, those who want to avoid a 2-button playstyle and have better scaling options into the endgame should be seriously considering this. Especially with Ultimatum coming back, using a circle skill to kill the monsters in a circle is thematically correct. Other than the insanely high damage effectiveness of Vaal Flameblast, one of the most powerful things about it is the ridiculously low Vaal soul gain prevention time. After only 3 seconds, you can start regaining souls again for Vaal skills. In comparison, something like Vaal Detonate Dead has an 8-second lockout. Further, soul generation continues to happen through ignite damage on bosses, so it is likely and probably optimal to only use Vaal Flameblast when bossing after the initial cast. Wave Conviction serves as the primary clear skill for this, giving automatic application for Mastermind of Discord until you're able to get fire exposure on hit gloves as an implicit later. Here, I would likely swap to Frostblink as my primary skill, ending up with a Frostblink Vaal Flameblast setup. In general, I think this is one of the easiest builds to follow, with fairly simple progression and very few problems that you'll actually need to troubleshoot as you're playing through it. Additionally, I am releasing this guide obviously before gems come out, the Transfigure gems, because I don't really know how accessible these gems will actually be. That said, the build obviously works without them, given that I'm playing without them in this POB, but I'll probably look to update that when that information is released. Anyway, let's get into the details for this thing. So I want to get started right away with early progression. I've tried to put a little bit more effort into the tree and everything this time, and the early game for this is still fairly straightforward. It's sort of the base leveling for racing that I'd recommend. Using a rolling magma setup at level 4 with Ellie Prolith, and this pretty much carries you all the way to level 28, at which point you'd be equipping Flameblast and Armageddon Brand. So Armor Brand in this setting is your clear skill throughout pretty much the entire campaign, unless you want to swap to Wave Conviction, and then Flameblast is your main single target skill. You just pre-channel this before you fight a boss. When the boss spawns or runs out of immunity phase, you let go, and it'll pretty much one-shot the boss right away. These are your gem links, pretty straightforward stuff. I do like an early period of elements if you're a newer player. If you're more experienced, you might like to do library early on in the game and then run haste immediately. The tree should be fairly straightforward as well. I don't opt for life early, and I do take both of these nodes because I find it to be pretty good in terms of raw damage. Increase in damage really strong early. I am skipping Elemental Overload because I'm not an armor curvation setup. You don't really get good overload uptime when you're playing Flameblast, and honestly you don't really need the damage. As you enter maps, you start to round out your tree a little bit more to the left side, grabbing both aura clusters, and then I do take dual curse probably around yellow maps. It's in here, not really that important. Eldritch Battery usually comes in for me around level 50, so my tree probably looks something like this. You're going up through here, ending up here, and as I finish this area, I path through here, unspec these nodes, and then path up towards Eldritch Battery and grab Snowforge. The rest of the tree comes around the time maps start. In terms of ascendancy order, I take Shaper Flames first, although you can go for these two initially if you want to go for an Armageddon Brand Cremation leveling setup, but I take this at normal, Cruel, Merciless, and then this at Uber. Now, you can also go for this at Merciless if you value life, don't really want to lose XP. Not really sure which one's actually better. Just up to you, preference. As you get into maps though, the socket pressure does become a little bit higher. This particular setup isn't that important until you probably get into Reds or even into T16s, because the Arcanist Brand Flam Ellie Weak Flame Surge is what enables Defiled Forces. Sort of the key mechanic making Vaal Flameblast really OP and infinite on single target. This allows you to refresh the duration of ailments when you curse an enemy, and yes, Arcanist Brand curses count towards this. I generally don't take this until I'm at least level 75, probably level 80 usually on a lot of times. But I would say if you're really struggling with gem pressure, especially in softcore, don't worry about your guard skill, and don't worry about this until you get later on in the game, just make sure you have these two curses. Now let's talk about the early endgame or like mid-game sort of thing, once you get into T16s, have your 2 stones, and are looking to farm initial endgame content to build up that pool of couple hundred divines to reroll into an endgame build. Or even the endgame version of this thing, which isn't honestly that expensive. So the tree becomes much more slim around here. I am eventually getting Searing Heat because this is pretty efficient, especially when you have Defiled Forces. Now, I think even in Ultimatum, having this fast ignite won't be a bad thing because the soul game prevention of Vaal Flameblast is just so short. Spiritual 8 doesn't calc that well numerically in terms of raw damage, but I do value this 1% regen you get over here, and I think having just something that isn't negative regen really helps out this build, especially if you opt to, fit Blood Rage into your socket somehow. The skill challenge setup is roughly the same as it was during early maps, but let's go over the gearing because this is probably where things start to matter. Honestly, in early map gear, nothing is really set in stone as far as I see it. Just gearless, it should hit about 1.5 mil single target with an aura swap, and then mapping DPS in early maps you have around, I don't know, 600-700k with level 19 gems. I have the whole run. I'll upload what I did on my 2-stone run, but this is fairly easy, about 6 hours to eat our Exarch. Mid game. You're looking for a couple mods on your weapon. You don't care that much about cast speed because this isn't detonate dead, so you're looking for fire damage, damage over time multi, fire dot multi, and +1 fire. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but especially if you're taking Spiritual Aid, you could use a Minion Essence and then try to hit like +1, or just use a Minion Essence, Benchcraft, Fire Dot Multi. The shield is pretty flexible. You can go for this shield with fire damage or fire spell skill gems, but I think both the evasion bases, evasion hybrid, ES hybrid, and pure evasion are good. So if you go for evasion ES hybrid, you can much more quickly accelerate your suppression and probably hit suppression cap because you have that 5% implicit. It also helps out with your ES pull, which is important because you're playing Eldritch Battery, and just having, I don't know, somewhere around 700, 900 ES makes this build feel much more comfortable. An evasion shield can be good too if you're running a 9% movement speed implicit. So I don't know all of them off the bat, but I do know the lowest level one is a War Buckler, and evasion bases, pure evasion bases, are also more likely to hit suppression when you're rolling. Helmet, don't really care. I'm looking for Corel. However, I do value this Eater implicit much more than Fizz taken as early on in the game because I'm going to be doing a lot of boss farming, playing destructive play, doing invitations. Having this sort of modifier is really, really powerful and just makes the early game, especially when your damage is a little bit lighter on boss farming, much better. Cook of Flame is the one unique I'm fishing for right away. In the early game, I think I'm having like a 5 link in the PoE for this instead. I mean, obviously just get as much as you can, but Cloak of Flame is really strong. It lets you completely drop Determination, which allows you to get one more offensive aura. It also has better max Fizz hit mitigation than generic armor on a relatively low armor build. This paired with Grace should be pretty safe for mapping, I think, especially once you get 1 or then 2 mods on here later on in the game. Taste of Hate can also fit in as a flask, and I would run that while mapping. I don't know how expensive it is in softcore. In HC, it's always really expensive, so just a little bit unfamiliar. Gloves is all about the implicit for fire exposure on hit. Nothing else matters as much as that single implicit. It allows you to swap out Wave Conviction and not worry about exposure application through that. Boots, Scorched Ground, another really big implicit. There's quite a bit of non-damaging element scaling on Elementalist, and for Elementalist dot, you do want to lower resistance as much as possible. I like to have the move speed while chilled, and then pair that with a Silver Flask. You could also opt to run move speed Onslaught, but I don't know, or just generic move speed, who knows. But generic boots, if you do have an open suffix here, non-damaging ailment craft is also available. You can see it, this craft here, and it should be a sizable DPS increase, almost like 4 to 5% in that range. Amulet, you're looking for, well, I guess 3 main mods. The first is damage over time multi, the second is fire skill gems or all skill gems, and the third is min charges, whether that be endurance charges or frenzy charges. Power doesn't matter because I don't play elemental overload. A lot of flexibility in this slot. And then rings. Rings, to me, are a big res cap area, but the one most important thing is that you use this focus shock modifier. Because, again, of defiled forces, this focus shock becomes infinite shock on bosses, and it's also really, really great because it has a base scaling and allows you to not worry about taking Shaper of Storms. And then even more, again, because we're an Elementalist doing the things that we're doing already on the build, scaling non-damaging elements, the shock does get scaled up. A belt like your rings in the early game is basically just a crutch to cap your res. A heavy belt can help out, especially if you need a higher strength requirement for things like strength or you're playing early game determination. But one of the nice things is that you don't actually need the regen betrayal ES craft, the regen 150 when a rare unique monster is nearby, because this isn't actually that mana intensive. Late game, tree is, jewels are in now. This transcendent mine is pretty solid. Not the most accessible thing probably, but who knows. I do run the combination of Blood Notch and Immutable. It's one of the possible setups. Again, depends on access, depends on cost. But this both solves your stun immunity and your hit-based recovery. Pair that with a little bit of recoup to round it out. If this isn't enough, you have another recoup wheel here. I'm not super familiar, I guess. Like, I haven't played a lot with Blood Notch Immutable. I've only used it on 2 builds. Both times this has felt okay, but especially if you're running something like Simulacrum, you might want to up your recovery even more. Or switch out for Defiance of Destiny. The reservation in the late game is actually different as well. Because the aura setup, because I'm running either Defiance of Destiny or Blood Untransmutable, if it's enough, I'm probably gonna look to skip Grace. And honestly, we'll see how that feels. Grace might need to go back in for one of my 50% auras, but it is what it is. Punitive Elements also comes back in later on, and that's basically for 3 reasons. One, I don't have any other offensive auras to run, so this is still swappable with Grace to Term. 2, it enables Watcher's Eyes for Fizz taken as. If I use a Fizz taken as Watcher's Eye, I'm pretty comfortably able to tank an Uber Shaper Slam with, this setup, Taste of Fate up, no guard skill. So it's also pretty solid. 3 is that I actually care much more about fill element immunity in the late game. If you're farming Exarch, you really want Ignite immunity so that if you tank a ball, you won't just burn to death, you don't need to use a flask. Alt ailments and simulacrum. Having this means that you can be much more greedy with your suffixes later on, when you actually can look for expensive but good offensive suffixes. Let's talk about the gear then. It's not super high investment gear. I still keep it relatively low, and I think the damage is still decent. I am configuring a couple things. If you take this stuff out, the damage will go up, so I mean, it is what it is. It doesn't hurt to have really high damage. Dog cap isn't really real anyway, especially when you're farming Ubers. So I just pretty much have added on damage over time multi. I think this is a pretty easy craft to do. The shield, you get a lot of suppression from here. Fire as Chaos is a decent craft. Because of Shaper of Flames, this, just gives you more ignite damage. On the helmet now, we're definitely going for Fizz as Elemental and the Flame Curse effect. You do need suppression. Obviously, this helmet looks insane, but there is some suffix flexibility in other slots. Cloak of Flame, +2, +4, both really good. I wouldn't swap out Cloak. The Ignite duration is quite nice too, because oftentimes you might not be playing perfectly, and this gives you a little bit more leeway to keep your Arcanist brand up for, again, Defiled Forces. The gloves are just exposure. I am considering running Ignite Prolif. It kind of depends. Fire damage over time multi is probably a little bit better, since I do want to use Ignite Prolif as one of my main links. It does have a better radius, and there aren't a lot of really strong skill or support gems for Vaal Flameblast anyway. Let's go ahead and switch that one out, but it's still fairly low in terms of the cost. +2 AoE is nice, because this is probably where my Frostblink would live, and then that gives you +2 levels to Frostblink. Just a little bit of extra clear damage if necessary. Over here, Faster Ignite, Scorch, implicit, generic boost otherwise. Don't need Sun Immunity if you go for Blood Untransmutable. Don't need Element Avoidance because we're running Purity of Elements. Action speed can also be nice if you just want to map faster. Up to you. I think Scorch Ammo is good. The Simplex Amulet. So about 3 amulets here. One is Replica Dragonfang's Flight. This tends to actually be really cheap from what I can tell. I don't know if they're going to alter drop rates, what the axe is going to be like, what the demand's going to be like. This tends to be somewhere between 1 and 4 divines based on what I've seen in softcore races. It might be what I opt for early, but a Simplex Amulet is a little bit better. Before we talk about the Simplex, number 2, I think it's Defiance of Destiny. So this coming in, I'd want to switch my Jewel setup and then run this instead of Blood Untransmutable, and then do manual stun immunity through stun avoidance on gloves and stun avoidance on Abyss Jewels. Really good defensive amulet. I don't really know which one I want to go with, but if I can skip Defiance, I will, because it's not offensive at all. Number 3 is this Simplex. So Simplex amulets are kind of annoying to craft. My sense that to craft this one is pretty much just raw chaos spamming for damage over time multi T2+. It's on average somewhere between 300 and 400 chaos, so it's not super crazy. And then you'd be looking to luck suffix on this and unveil. And on the unveil, you're looking for a couple things. If it's a prefix, you're looking for life. If it's a suffix, you're looking for min charges maybe, min frenzy, that double that, non-damage ailment effect, and maybe res and chaos you might consider, and then finish with the benchcraft for life in that case. If you hit life, then you just benchcraft non-damaging ailments. That's sort of what I'm thinking about ending on. Shouldn't be too expensive to do. Replica Emberwake, this continues to be a really strong ring, especially with Defiled Forces. But even with it, my actual ignite duration isn't that crazy short. It's still 2.57, so it's not like the end of the world, I think, to run this thing, especially while mapping. It's totally okay. Focus Shock this time on a Vermilion, Essence of Delirium for dot multi if you can greet it. If you can't, whatever, but Purity of Elements should give you the flexibility to do this sort of thing. You can also do a Reforged Chaos after Suffix Lock and hope to hit that, or an Odd Chaos, whatever it may be. Stitch and Vise here just gives you access to a Jewel. You really want to have this thing. CB immunity phasing lets you run Uber Sears much more comfortably with the CB here instead of on a flask or on your tree. And then phasing because we don't really want it on other sources. I want to play double Life Flask when I'm bossing at least. When I'm mapping, you can run, I don't know, whatever you want. If you want more damage, throw in a Bottled Faith. You want a little bit more survivability, Progenesis comes in. Taste of Hate's here because it's actually cheap. Progenesis, don't know what that'll be like. Quicksilver, Silver just for speed. And then Watcher side, there's 3 primary mods you want. One is Anger, Damage, Fire Damage. 2, the Damaging Ailments or Dot Multi from Malevolence are both solid. And then 3, Fizz, Shift, Fizz taking ass with Purity of Elements. It's probably the strongest mod. I don't really know which one's to opt for, but this is just an early game Watcher's Eye that happens to be here. So all in all, this explanation is a little bit more long-winded than it probably needed to be, but as you can see, it's got pretty solid numbers. It's fairly straightforward in terms of how to progress the build. The gear looks not very difficult to achieve, even in my, late game quote-unquote POV. And the damage is probably close to regular dot cap, at least. So, if you want a really nice league starter, especially for the upcoming league, great clear, great bossing, smooth progression. I think it's really going to be hard to beat either this or, obviously, the better choice, DD Ignite Elementalist.